and real life.
Good evening, everybody. This is yet another session of CSGCM. We are holding our second lecture series, which is titled Rereading Sustainability. And today's seminar has two presenters, Dr. Annoy Mukhopadhyay and Dr. and Shubhrata Vishwas. Our first speaker is Annoy. I will introduce Annoy and then without wasting further time, I will hand over the session to him. Dr. Annoy Mukhopadhyay is an assistant professor, Department of Humanities and Social Sciences from IIT Kharagpur, India. He has been a former assistant professor of the Department of English and Cultural Studies at the University of Burdwan. He was also an assistant professor at the Department of English at Benares Hindu University. He is an associate faculty for for Advanced Studies in South Asia, Lalitpur, Nepal. Anna has authored quite a number of books from very prestigious publishers. The Authority of Female Speech in Indian Goddess Traditions, Devi and Woman's Planning from Palgrave Macmillan, USA. The Goddess in Hindu Tantric Traditions, Devi as Corpse from London and New York, Routledge. Literary and Cultural Readings of Goddess Spirituality, The Red Shadow of the Mother from Cambridge Scholars Publishing. And lastly, by Fiction Matters, Reading and Understanding Fiction in Contemporary Times from Pencraft International. He is a guest editor of the edited collection on thematizations of the goddess in South Asian cinema from Cambridge Scholars Publishing. Today, he'll be presenting a paper on Towards Sustainable Interfaith Dialogues, Social Inclusivity, and Interreligious Understanding in a Multicultural Society. So over to Online.
Thank you, Professor Chakraborty. And I must thank the organizers for thinking about such an innovative topic. This is innovative and also very important because whenever we talk about sustainability, we tend to keep our focus confined to the domain of ecology and economy and all these things. We generally tend to ignore the role of culture in the discourses of sustainability. So I'm going to address that issue. And when I got this invitation, I first thought about the most important issue, which is quite relevant to the entire globe today. That is the issue of interreligious understanding and communal harmony, especially with reference to the multi-religious societies that we inhabit almost all over the world. Because earlier there was this idea that certain societies were multi-religious and certain societies were not. But now we know that in a way all societies are multi-religious because due to the global flow of people, of cultures, religions are also traveling. So even in the Western countries where earlier there was an idea of a kind of Christocentric social framework or some kind of secularist social framework later on, after after the advent of the Enlightenment and all these things, even in those societies we see a multi-religious framework today. Now I am not going into the debatable dimensions of these frameworks, like how substantially multi-religious. But nevertheless, I would like to deal with a few important issues that can be relevant to multi-religious societies in general and to India in particular, because which can be a better example of a multi-religious society than the Indian society, right? So I think I should start sharing my PPT as well. Yeah. So share screen and then let me go here. I think it's visible now. Okay. Yeah. So while talking about multi-religious societies in the context of sustainability, we also need to make sure that we understand these concepts well. So first, let me begin with the role of culture in the discourses of sustainability. Now, as per Vert and others have observed, the Brundtland report focused on sustainability in terms mainly of ecological, economic, and social factors. But nevertheless, in that report, there was also the possibility of, I mean, it actually opened up the possibility of looking at sustainability from the cultural dimension as well. And interestingly, the relationship between culture and sustainability has been thought in the Western countries, especially in the Nordic countries in various ways. But what is interesting for us is that when we try to apply some of these ideas to our multi-religious and multicultural society, we find that in fact some of the ideas that these scholars and activists have come up with can actually be applicable to our society very well, even though we have tried to separate the discussion of religion from the discussion of peace and conflict studies and all these things. So I would try to, in disciplinary terms, or rather interdisciplinary terms, I would like to connect these two different disciplines, peace studies and religious studies. But nevertheless, what I'm going to do is not just an intellectual deliberation on this kind of interdisciplinary framework, but rather I'm trying to look at the concrete ways in which we can make sure that we move towards a sustainable future of communal harmony and interreligious understanding, multi-faith dialogues. So Voigtman also says that when we talk about culture in the context of sustainability, we actually tend to look at culture in three different ways, different but interrelated ways as well. So first, we can see culture as integral to the very concept of sustainability. So there is an integral and organic connection between the epistemology of sustainability and the cultural epistemologies that any society may have. Then we can see culture as a tool in other policy areas, for instance, environment, industry, human settlement, etc. So here, culture can be used as a method. The cultural factors can operate as tools in ensuring sustainable economy or say environmental sustainability. And then finally, we can think about culture in a very wide way. We can see culture as synonymous with or coterminous with human action and interaction. So here we take the largest possible definition of culture. Now, from here, I would like to jump over, so to speak, to the issue of religions in a multicultural society. Because whenever we are talking about culture, we have to talk about religion. And interestingly, whenever we talk about cultural studies, we often tend to assume that that the secular order is globally sort of prevalent, and we don't really need to talk about religions or something like that. Or even when we talk about religions, we tend to marginalize the discipline of religious studies within the contours of literary and cultural studies. But that is something which we need to rectify. That approach needs to be rectified, because religion, especially in countries like India, but in other countries as well, even in the Western countries, religions are extremely important. So you can't actually wish away their presence. So rather than seeing religions as as something negative, something regressive, we need to think we can channelize the forces of religious cultures in a positive direction. So that's what I'm going to argue in this presentation. And when we talk about religions in a multicultural society, we need to focus on certain existing problems, certain existing epistemological as well as methodological problems in terms of talking about religions within the academia and also outside the academia. Because my focus is not just on the discussion of religion in the academia, but rather also on the the possibility of thinking about alternative policies that can ensure multicultural negotiation, intercultural understanding, interreligious understanding, multi-faith dialogue. So how you can bridge the gap between the ethical principles that we are always discussing and the social reality. So that would be the the central theme in this presentation. So first of all, we need to think of the significant role that religions play in any multicultural society, especially in a society like India, where you have palimpsestic structures, you have different levels of engagement with faith systems, you have multiple faiths, and plurality is in a way chaotic here. So I always say that it's not chaotic or cosmic in the context of India, but plurality is something which can be referred to in terms of a chaosmos, as it were, to borrow the Joycean term. Then we also need to take into account the problems and possibilities are felt by religions. The problem is that we often tend to focus on the problems, and we tend to ignore the possibilities of social cohesiveness that might be offered by religions. So rather than seeing religions as a problem, we can see them as opening up certain possibilities which we need to think about imaginatively. Because if we don't approach religious cultures in an open-ended way and with an open mind, then we would probably think that they are not going to be beneficial for the society and so on and so forth. But rather than seeing religions as a problem for pluralism, we need to see religions as constitutive factors in cultural plurality. And then we also need to bridge the gap between the religious and the secular by bringing the religious and secular discourses, close to each other as far as social communication is concerned. We often tend to think that the larger framework of social communication that we see around us is a secular framework. So religions don't have any role to play in this context. But that's not the right thing to imagine, because whenever we talk about the religious discourses, we need to understand that they can be placed in a dialogue with the secular discourses. And if you think about the possible theoretical frameworks, then you can think about the notions of sacred secularity that the thinkers like Latamani and Raymond Panikkar have come up with. They talk about the sacred secular. So how to bridge the gap between the sacred and the secular, rather than seeing them, as locked in a perpetual agon, so to speak. And then we also need to create interfaith dialogues and situate them within the larger polylogic frameworks for thinking about social inclusivity, sustainable development not just in terms of economic development, but also in terms of social development, in terms of improving the happiness index, for instance. Because if you don't have a society where you have social harmony, you can't really have happiness either at the individual or at the collective level. So all these things need to be factored in when we think about multi-faith dialogue. So multi-faith dialogues are not just about a superficial kind of conversation between different religious discourses, but rather it needs to be powerfully grounded in the larger frameworks for thinking social inclusivity. Then we come to a very important issue, that is combining the discourse of difference with that of equality. Now, this is very important, at least for me, because whenever we talk about the cultural politics of difference, we tend to focus on difference, and we often tend to bracket off the issue of equality. But we need to understand that difference is always connected to equality. That is to say, if I am different from you, then it is not the case that there is no possibility of a common. So we are communicating with each other. There are differences, but there are common grounds as well. And most importantly, we are speaking to each other as equal human beings. So when we talk about differences in terms of differences between individuals or collectivities, we need to balance that discourse of difference with the discourse of equality. And this discourse of equality is extremely important. So this is something which is a kind of meta-theoretical framework that we need to keep in mind, because it's not just something which is related to the issue of religion. It's something which is related to the issue of gender as well. For instance, we talk about feminism that is grounded in the concept of equality, and feminism that is grounded in the concept of difference. But we need to understand that these two discourses are not really contradictory, but rather they can be brought together and connected in a harmonious way. Then we come to the issue of peace and conflict. Now, why am I talking about this? Because as we know, especially when we talk about religions in the present context, in the present global context, we often tend to see conflict as essentially related to religion. As it were, religion is the other of reason. Religion is the other of enlightenment, and there is conflict because of religion. Now, this is a very wrong idea, because if you probe deeply into the micro histories as well as the macro histories of conflict in different geopolitical milieux, you will find that it's never just religion which is responsible for conflict. For instance, even if you talk about global terror, or global terrorism rather, you have to think about the weapon industry that is feeding into this. And you can't say that there is an organic link between religious understanding and the weapon industry. The weapon industry is something which is directly related to the global capitalist framework, and we need to factor that in when we talk about global terrorism. So rather than blaming religion for everything, we should try to look at the very complex enmeshed networks of many other factors, economic factors, social factors, political factors, which are responsible for the conflicts which we often tend to attribute to religion alone. And this is something which is the need of the day. This kind of comprehensive understanding of conflict is something which is the need of the hour. So here I would first try to look at certain alternative discourses that have come up in the field of peace studies in recent times, and here I am mainly drawing on the policy shifts and also the epistemic shifts in terms of understanding peace and implementing the principle of peace building that the UNESCO has come up with in recent times, especially if you think about the 2018 document published by the UNESCO called Long Walk of Peace. That was a very interesting document because that document spoke about the necessity to look at peace, the very concept of peace, in radically different ways, right? Rather than just seeing peace as the absence of war, violence, or conflict. So they came up with some comprehensive understanding of peace, which we can apply to the local and national levels of conflict resolution, or all these discourses as well. So it's not a case that what they are talking about would apply only to the global sort of scenario. It is something which can be applicable to our local and national scenarios as well. And that's why I would like to focus on these concepts, and then I will move over to their relevance to our understanding of religion in our society and the issue of multi-faith dialogue and all these things. So first we come to this notion of positive peace, which is a notion about peace given by Johann Galtung. So Galtung talks about peace being, peace as something which should be considered to be the base of the human society. So it should not be seen as something which is superfluous, right? So which is a superimposition. Rather, it is something which is the norm, and conflict is the aberration. So he says that we have to think about positive peace rather than peace in negative terms. So we see peace as the absence of conflict, the absence of violence, the absence of war, and so on and so forth. But we need to see peace in itself as a central value for the human civilization. That's what he says. And this is very interesting because when we talk about peace and conflict, you would often find that we take two directions. On the one hand, you can see peace as the base and conflict as the aberrational superstructure, as it were, a superstructure that is unstable as well as destabilizing. Or you can see conflict as the basic human nature and peace as a kind of superfluous superstructure that you impose on this, right? So it depends on the perspective that you adopt. And in this context, it's also necessary to focus on the discourse of deliberative democracy versus agonistic democracy. Now, agonistic democracy, the proponents of agonistic democracy, of course, come up with certain interesting and important ideas. For instance, if you think about Shatanmukh and others, they are talking about the incommensurable differences that might exist in a society between perspectives, between ideologies, between worldviews, and that's fine. But at the same time, we also need to take into consideration an oppositional idea, which is the idea of agon culture. So, for instance, Claudio Colagueri talks about the agon culture, where we are motivated by what one might call agonal rationality. Now, this kind of agonal rationality, which tries to justify conflict as a basic condition of being as far as the human society and human existence are concerned. So this is really a problematic thing, because if you celebrate this, then you will actually come up with this idea that peace is not really the base of our human civilization. It is something which is an intermittent dream, and conflict is the reality, both in psychological and social terms. But we need to rectify that as well. So we need to question this agonal rationality as well. And then we come to the notion of just peace that Blazrak and Appleby come up with. So they talk about the necessity to ensure that there is no systemic injustice within a society. Only then can we really talk about just peace. And Blazrak also focuses on moral imagination. He talks about the creative dimension of our moral imagination. So I will try to apply this notion to certain aspects of our multicultural society as well. And then we talk about another possible ethical framework that can be seen as as helpful in talking about multi-faith dialogues. That is the ethics of cohabitation that Judith Butler speaks of. She says that we inhabit a planet where we are not really in a position to choose our neighbors. We don't really have the opportunity to choose who we are living with. That is why we have to understand that the ethics of cohabitation is a must in order to ensure that we live sustainably on this planet. And then finally, we come to the notion of multicultural literacy. Now, this notion has been propounded by many people. James Banks has also talked about this, but in the UNESCO document, Long Walk of Peace, you have a reference to multicultural literacy. In fact, there is a particular segment devoted to the idea of multicultural literacy, and this is something which is in a way central to my understanding of the problems and possibilities associated with any multi-religious society. It is something like this, that whenever we talk about multiculturalism, we tend to think of cultural plurality as a social phenomenon, right? We don't really tend to think about multicultural literacy, which is a must for training us to live with other cultures in a harmonious way. So multicultural literacy is something which is connected to multicultural social existence, but it's not something which would emerge automatically from multicultural social existence. That doesn't mean that it can't emanate at all from multicultural social existence, but the point is that it would be wrong to believe that a multicultural society is literate. So that is something which is very important, because this is something which we need to factor in when we talk about education policies. For instance, when we talk about education policies, we often tend to think that religion is something which can be bracketed off, and we can just talk about secular education. But we need to include this issue of multicultural literacy on our agenda for framing, new education policies or new cultural policies as well. Okay. Now let me come to the problems that we specifically face in India. Now, number one, where is multicultural literacy on the agenda? is it really there as far as our education policies are concerned, our cultural policies are concerned? In Canada, for instance, you have such policies. They are implementing such policies, and they have certain, well formulated ideas about such policies, and formulating certain modes of pedagogy on the basis of such principles. But are we really doing that? That is to say, is it the case that there is actually a disjuncture between our multicultural social reality and our educational and cultural policies, and our educational and cultural principles? Is it the case that somehow there is some kind of lack of coordination between multicultural literacy and multicultural social reality in the case of India? So this is something which we need to think over. Then we also need to bring up the question, is there a focus on multi-faith dialogue at the social level, especially at the grassroots level, rather than just something, rather than thinking about something which is continuously mediated by political actors, that the politicians will talk about multi-faith dialogues, or the politicians will talk about communal harmony. But where do we exactly have a focus on multi-faith dialogue at at the different layers of our society? And as I said, I repeat, at the grassroots level, because that is very important. If you talk about multi-faith dialogues only in the academia, only within the hallowed circuits of the media, then it's not going to help you. It is something which has to be implemented at the level of the grassroots activities of our citizens, right? So we need to democratize this notion of multi-faith dialogue as well. We need to de-elitize this notion as well. That it's not just about holding a few seminars. It's not just about, in fact, conferences have been held on this issue. I saw such a conference at BHU. I think, as far as I recall, the Templeton Foundation had also supported that program. But the point is that this is something which needs to be implemented at the level of the day-to-day activities and the day-to-day lives of common people. And then I come to the lacunas in the quote-unquote civil society's understanding of religiosity and the sacred. Now, there are two problems. On the one hand, the civil society in India, unfortunately or fortunately, I don't know, it often tries to assume a secular stance, and it sees secular, the secular perspective as a kind of given. So there is some kind of unwillingness to engage with the discourses, the epistemologies of religiosity and the sacred as far as our civil society is concerned. They will become concerned with religion when it comes to riots. So they will think about religion not in times of peace, but in times of conflict. And if you do that, of course, you are not really able to solve the problems, because the culture of peace, the culture of multi-faith understanding, interfaith understanding, is something which needs to be built up at the level of everyday life. Okay, so it can't be just at the moments of chaos or crisis that you would talk about religion. This is one problem. And then there is also an attitudinal problem, a problem of approach. That is, our civil society often thinks that they are the peacemakers, and and the people who are there at the grassroots level, the people who are not so privileged, who don't have so much cultural capital, so they are somehow potential problem makers. So they are the problem makers, and the civil society is the solution provider. So this kind of hierarchical imagination of the society is also problematic, because they need to understand that people, they need to see them as their equals and not as their inferiors. This is a problem, because our civil society often suffers from a superiority complex that emerges from elitist discourses and elitist orientations. So this is something which we need to rethink radically. If we don't do that, then ultimately the gap between the civil society and the lay religious people will become unbridgeable. So we need to think over this. And then we come to the issue of the invention and enshrinement of the domain of the unspeakable. Now, I deliberately, include this issue in my presentation, because if we probe deeply into our deliberations on religion, we would find that often we tend to push religious issues into the domain of the unspeakable. For instance, when we talk about riots, we talk about them being sensitive issues. But I personally think that this is actually a very insensitive way to look at these problems, right? You can't just say that these are sensitive issues, so don't talk about these things. Rather than talking about riots as sensitive issues which must be bracketed off, you should rather try to look at the problems involved in such moments of conflict. What really gone awry? What had really gone awry? You need to think about the possible solutions which would be sustainable. That is to say, solving one moment of conflict, or rather, trying to bring people out of one particular moment of conflict will not do if you are not thinking about a sustainable solution to these problems. So you probably manage one riot, but what do you do with the next ones? So you need to create a social structure, you need to create a social atmosphere where it becomes possible to build up a sustainable culture of peace and harmony, which would ensure that there is no more riot, that there is no more conflict. Right, so that is very important. But I think this is a post-colonial continuation of the colonial administrative gesture to rights, because our colonial masters saw these rights as as problems specifically made by Indians. They thought that the Indians were pugnacious, so this is something which they are going to do because India is a market, as E.M. Foster would tell you. But we need to come up with other solutions which would be sustainable. Now, I am not saying that I am going to give the final solution. No one can give the final solution, but the point is that one continuously needs to think about these things in a creative way, right? So this needs a kind of policy intervention which would ask you to exert your creativity to the extreme level. So creative thinking is very important in this context, and out of the box thinking as well. Now, in a way, I see this gesture of pushing everything that is related to religion to the domain of unspeakable as a gesture which actually carries the legacy of the partition of India, because we know that it was a moment of enormous violence, enormous social fragmentation, and there is actually always a fear of reliving that moment. There is a kind of subconscious fear in the South Asian mind to revisit that terrible moment. So there is some kind of psychological mechanisms for escaping the possibility of revisiting that moment. But past is not something which you can wish away. You need to negotiate with this. You need to walk through it, and then you need to exercise the ghosts of the past. Otherwise, if you try to push these problems to the domain of the unspeakable, then ultimately there would be the inevitable return of the repressed, and you will go back to that point of which you so sincerely wanted to escape. So that's a problem which we need to think about, and rather than trying to gloss over these issues, we need to rather creatively come up with possibilities of building up a culture of multi-faith dialogue in times of peace, not in times of conflict. Because if you do that only in times of conflict, then of course your goodwill is going to be questioned by the people involved, because they would get to understand that you are not really interested in doing this at times of peace, but this is something which we need to do at times of peace. So this should be on our agenda, as I said, at the level of our everyday social existence. And of history and escape from the praxis that the present calls for. So history is politicized, and in history there are multiple points of religious conflict. Now we need to acknowledge this reality rather than wishing away these realities. But at the same time, this acknowledgement should not go on to foster violence, further violence, but rather we should try to see history as something which teaches us how to come out of history, right? But we can see history with a corrective approach rather than with an approach that would foster further violence and further animosity between communities. And so this is what I call the gesture of being devoured by history rather than cleaning up its entrance to reach a future of sustainable social harmony. So this approach needs to be corrected. Okay, now what could be done? As I said, the burden of memory has to be faced. We can't really escape from it. So we can't just say that no, everything was fine in the past and the British came and they made us communal and that kind of stuff. No, there were problems, there were moments of conflict in pre-colonial India as well. So we have to face that burden of memory. We have to acknowledge that. But at the same time, it's important to neutralize the negative emotion that might be generated by the process of revisiting this history. So we need to re-educate our historical consciousness in such a way that when we revisit this kind of burden of memory, we are not flooded by negative emotions, but we know how to come out of that cycle of violence. So you revisit the burden of memory in order to ensure that those moments of conflict are not repeated in future. And understanding the other is very important rather than demonizing or trivializing the other. Now see, in India, the problem is not just about demonizing the other, there is also the problem of trivializing the other. So I am not seeing what the other sees as sacred, as really something which can be considered sacred. So if my understanding of the sacred doesn't become compatible with your understanding of the sacred, then what you hold to be sacred would not be sacred for me. Now, this approach is a very problematic approach, and this is not something which just, which is related to religious communities alone. Rather, many, secular people also think that, since they have one particular idea about the sacred, and they might not even, naturally hold anything to be sacred, that, they can desacralize anything that the other holds to be sacred. So this approach needs to be rectified. We need to understand that I might not consider something to be sacred, but you might consider that to be sacred, and your understanding of something as sacred is important for me. That doesn't mean that I have to consider that to be sacred, which you hold to be sacred, but your holding that to be sacred should be respected by me. So this is what mutual respect actually means, and that also requires some kind of moral imagination, because you need to empathetically imagine the sacred that is figured forth by the other. Then respect difference without fetishizing it. So we all know that during the partition there was a fetishization of difference. It was thought that two communities can't live together at all, but that is actually false. And whenever we talk about difference, we need to understand that differences are always going to be there. Differences are going to operate not just at a collective level, but also at the interpersonal level. But that doesn't mean that my difference from you would bracket off any possibility of my communication with you or my cultural negotiation with you. So that kind of fetishization of difference is to be resisted. And then I have already talked about respecting what the others hold to be sacred. They create scope and possibilities for reflexivity in religious education. This is a very important issue because whenever we talk about religious education, we have two patent approaches. Either we say, okay, so it's religious education, we, the secular people, have nothing to do with this, so we are not going to even think about this. Or we try to trivialize it, that religious education is something which is not our cup of tea, and not just that, we are not going to take it seriously. It is something which we can trivialize. Now that approach is very problematic, because religious education is something can't just say that they are inferior people, that they are irrational and so on and so forth. So that approach is problematic. Then secondly, there is another approach, that is okay, so the domain of religious education is completely autonomous. The state has nothing to do with this, the civil society has nothing to do with this, let it be, let it operate on its own. Now my point is that of course it has its autonomy, the sector of religious education has its autonomy, and I'm not saying that the nation state should intervene into it, But we again need to shift from the discourse of intervention to the discourse of cooperation, collaboration, and coordination. For instance, if the civil society and the representatives or the representatives of the civil society were really interested in building up multi-faith dialogue in India in a sustainable way, if they can coordinate with the religious educators, then probably there might be included the fact, the principle of reflexivity, self-reflexivity, and flexibility in religious education. For instance, if I am a religious educator, then of course I should enjoy some autonomy, but that autonomy can't be unlimited, because every social sector is relatively autonomous, but each of these social sectors is also interconnected with the other social sectors, and this principle of interconnectivity is as important as that of autonomy. So this is what we need to think about, and if we can reorient the ideologies or the principles involved in religious education, then it would be beneficial for the next generation, which is going to be trained in that tradition, because that tradition of religious education is still there in India. And rather than demonizing it, or rather than saying that it's terrible, we should try to reorient it slightly, and that can be done not in an interventionist way, in a statistically interventionist way, but rather in a way that would be focusing on collaboration and cooperation. Okay, then and this is something which I have already talked about, that if you don't believe something which the other holds to be sacred, then that doesn't mean that you have the right to profane that figuration of the sacred. And then I come to this notion of maintaining and perpetuating binaries, which has been a very huge problem in post-colonial India. Now, what are these binaries? Let me come to it. So on the one hand, you have this binary of communalism and secularism, and interesting, this is a matter of mutual blame game. So I would call you communalist, and I would call myself secularist, and you would call me communalist, and I would call you secularist. So this game goes on and on and on, and this keeps generating the vicious circles wherefrom it appears that there is no escape. Okay, so we have to find out the escape route, because if we don't do that, then we are moving towards a future of social fragmentation rather than a future of social harmony and social integration. Then the notion of majority, minority. Now these terms are relative terms. We all know that these terms have their force in a context specific way, and still we keep using these terms indiscriminately. And secondly, when we talk about these things, we tend to forget that a society that is truly just society would not even generate the notion of someone being majority and someone else being minority, because ultimately it is the principle of equality which should bind the society together. So if I meet someone who is from another community, then the communication between us should not be the communication between two people from majority community and minority community or something like that, but rather it should be the communication between two absolutely equal citizens who have absolutely equal sets of rights, and that is something which we need to ensure. And that would also square with the framework of just peace. Then inclusive, exclusive, again, we would always talk about these things to the point of making these terms meaningless, and we would always say that we are inclusive and you are exclusive, right? But the point is that true inclusivity is possible only through negotiation. So it is not something which can be possible through legal or administrative frameworks. It's something which has to be ensured through proper social interaction between different communities, different faith communities. Philosophical kind of binary, but that is also problematic, and I have already talked about it, agonistic and deliberative. Now, there can't be just agonal rationality, and there can't be just deliberation. So there should be some kind of middle ground, okay, where we take into account, where we respectfully take into account the different founding principles that different communities or different collectivities may speak from, but we also need to think about the universal values that can be endorsed by all the communities. I will also come to that point later. Then we have this notion of peaceful, terroristic. Now, no community is essentially peaceful, no community is essentially terroristic. These are sort of matters of socio-political contingency, and this is something we need to understand. And then the most famous one, ask them. Okay, so we are good, they are bad. We are trying to do something good, they are doing something bad, that kind of thing. And it's something which pervades every sphere of our life. So a kind of exclusionary discourse, or rather an exclusionary meta-narrative, seems to be the order of the day, and that's very problematic, because that actually completely shatters any possibility of creating a sustainable culture of peace and social stability. Then progressive, regressive. Again, I am progressive, you are regressive. This is problematic because these are also relative terms, and we need to more more cautiously use these terms. And then finally, my phobia, your phobia. And interestingly, most often you will find that the discourse runs in this way: my phobia is justified, your phobia is not. Okay, so your phobia is irrational, my phobia is rational. Right. Now, this is also extremely problematic, because if we go on with this, then we are actually creating more boundaries between between groups, between collectivities, rather than breaking boundaries. Okay, then there is the myth of incommensurability, that there are these different communities and they can't gel together at all. No possibility, no common ground at all. So arguments that make sustainable social harmony impossible. These arguments would include such approaches: the discourse of absolute difference, that there is no common ground; the impossibility of gelling with X. They are so different that we can't really gel with them. They are always like that. Okay, so they are immutable. So the idea is that we are changing, we are evolving, but they are not evolving, right? And here any community, any religious community, any social group would often use such discourse, which is deeply problematic, because evolution is something which is happening at all levels. So every single individual is also evolving through their lives. So the entire community, whether it's one group in the society or the society as a whole, it's also evolving. So they are always like that is a false discourse and a problematic one. Then we come to a sustainable framework for possibilizing interreligious understanding. So how can we really think about the possibilities rather than focusing solely on the problems? Now, one is dissociating religion from the politics industry. You all know what the politics industry is and how it runs, how it operates. So I don't need to get into that. And you might accuse me of utopism. I will not blame you, because in a way, it's really apparently absurd to talk about the dissociation of religion from the politics industry, because it appears that that is the norm of the day. But nevertheless, let's think utopically, because without thinking utopically, you can't really come up with the vision of sustainability, because sustainability is always a utopic vision. It's a vision that requires creative thinking, that requires imaginative construction of new spaces, new world orders. So let's be utopic for the time being. Then encouraging a general culture of peace and responsible social interaction. So that is very important, because religion doesn't operate in a void. So if the entire society is engaging in in fractious kinds of social interaction, fragmenting kinds of social interaction, which which break the bonds between people rather than bringing them together, then you can't really have a general culture of peace or intercultural understanding. So within that context, multi-religious existence will really face a problem. Seriously, the discourse of mutual respect, which we always give a lip service to, but we don't really take into consideration. So we need to seriously focus on this issue: mutual respect between religions, and it means that it should be really mutual. that it's not the case that it's my responsibility to respect you and it's not your responsibility to respect me. It's as much my responsibility to respect you as it is your responsibility to respect me. So that mutuality is something which should be underscored in our ethical principles and our policies, cultural policies as well. Then we come to the idea of the others sacred. So there is always a difference between the others sacred and my sacred. So what I consider to be sacred is sacred, but what you consider to be sacred is not. That is to be rectified. And we need to take the idea of plurality very seriously, because there are intra religious kinds of heterogeneity as well as interreligious levels of heterogeneity. So when we're talking about a multicultural community or a multi-religious community, we need to think about the plurality that is there within one religious framework, as well as that is there in terms of the multicultural and multi-religious social structure. And then stop seeing rationality as the other of religiosity. It's not the case that reason doesn't have any role to play in religious discourses. So there is a possibility of bridging the rational and the religious. But here I would very briefly mention one thing, that is, it need not be thought that reason alone can solve all problems. For instance, I would briefly mention the case of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu here. Now, you all probably know that he was originally, a rationalist kind of philosopher, because he dealt with Nyaya, Shastra, and all these things. So that was Indian logic. And then you have the switch over to devotionalism, right? But this devotionalism was also in a way beneficial for the society, because he spoke about the necessity to break the boundaries between castes. So he spoke of the necessity to question the social hierarchies and all these things, and these things were done, these things were made possible within that devotionalist framework rather than within that rationalist framework that he had sort of inhabited earlier. So, and then it's also important to strike a balance between universal values and context-specific values. So, I think that rather than seeing a continuous conflict between the universal values and the context-sensitive values, we need to combine them. And that is something which is a possibility. It's not the case that some religious community won't be able to do that. Everyone can do that, but we need to foster that kind of culture and that kind of orientation in a multi-religious society. Okay, so I have almost come to the end of this presentation. Before moving over to the last segment, I'll briefly mention the necessity to preserve the sacred things. This is very important because, when we talk about India, we often tend to talk about, just abstract religious ideas. But we need to understand that religion is also a felt experience. And for many communities, especially if you think about the indigenous communities, it has a kind of, religion involves a beautiful balance between the material and the spiritual. For instance, a tree becomes sacred, a river becomes sacred, a water body becomes sacred. Now, these sacred geographies and ecologies also need to be maintained. It needs to be ensured that even in times of conflict, there is no attack on these, sacred ecologies. This is, something which we need to remember. And then there is also the issue of proselytizing. Now, proselytizing, whether it's good or bad, we need to come out of that kind of discourse. We need to approach this issue in a different way. We need to ask whether proselytizing discourse denigrates the other's figuration of the sacred or it doesn't. If it denigrates the figurations of the sacred that the other holds to be important, then it is to be interrogated and it is to be rectified. And then we also need to, since so far we have not focused on gender at all, but after as well. So, but I don't have much time to elaborate on this point. But this is a point which actually requires another full lecture. So from our everyday discourses and from our day-to-day social interactions, we need to banish the gendered tropes, which are also tropes that we think with unconsciously or consciously. So we need to banish from even from our subconscious the tropes of violation, invasion, and defilement. All these are actually gender tropes, which we often apply to to the situations of religious conflict. So when you invade the the sacred place of worship for the other community, then you are actually unconsciously being driven by this gender tropes, that you are going to violate that space, you are going to invade that space, you are going to defile that sacred space of the other. So in a way, your approach is androcentric and phallocentric, and this is something which we need to factor in unequivocal terms. And then we need to encourage a verbal, visual, and political culture of nonviolence. That is very important, because without this kind of all-pervasive overall culture of nonviolence, we would be nowhere. Okay. Now, finally, I come to the problems. But before that, I will briefly mention one point. That is, when we talk about religious plurality in the Indian context, or in any context for that matter, we also need to come out of the habit of focusing only on the world religions. We often tend to talk about the world religions at the expense of the minor religions. So we are actually driven by this unconscious binarization of the world religions and the minor religions. The minor religions which are not considered to be world religions. For instance, if you think about the multiple indigenous religious frameworks in India, they are as important as the world religions. So whenever we are talking about religions, we shouldn't just talk about the major religions, but we should also talk about the minor religions. And the indigenous communities have very unique religious frameworks. Those religious frameworks, in addition to all their uniqueness, should be preserved and respected in our value system. Now the problems are this. And here you as it were come out of the dream, and you find the monsters who were waiting outside to sort of question and even shatter your utopic vision. So identifying the religious actors who can facilitate multi-faith dialogues. How do you identify them? So this is also associated with the problem of representation. So if I say that I am going to select this religious leader who is going to represent his faith community, then naturally the other people from that community might question this, because they would say this person is not the sole representative of our faith. And this is a serious problem as far as multi-faith dialogues are concerned in a pluricultural country like India, which is so diverse, and I repeat, which is so chaotically diverse that it's really difficult to imagine any kind of homogeneous framework of representation. Then the problem of political co-optation. So you are trying to do this at the societal level, but there might be politicians who would co-opt some of these people, and they would probably co-opt these actors who are otherwise involved in multi-faith dialogues, and they would try to channelize their energy in different and negative directions. So how do you deal with that? That's a problem. And then the problem of ostensibly incorrigible prejudices. So sometimes you find that there are religious actors who believe in prejudices which are apparently incorrigible, and this is a very serious problem. But as I said, we need to think about these problems in a comprehensive way, and we need to think of possible creative ways to come out of these problems, right? And that is why the policymakers, the civil society representatives, the social actors from different layers of the society can't refuse to be creative in addressing and redressing the conflicts which bother us. So creativity in terms of thinking, in terms of out of the box thinking, is very important, and it's extremely important to think about this. We often tend to talk about creative thinking in context of economy and so on and so forth, but religious harmony or interfaith dialogue is something which requires the same level of creativity, or rather more creative ways to deal with the problems, right? So ultimately, I'm not saying that creativity is the final solution, but creative thinking should be encouraged. We should encourage our students, we should encourage the scholars, we should encourage the common people, the people out there who are working in the field, so who are working at the grassroots level. We should encourage all of them to come up with the ideas, the alternative ideas, for creating a sustainable future of religious harmony and social stability, rather than fragmenting the society, and taking it to the Nabi. Thank you.
Thank you, Annoy, for a very thought-provoking and even systematic presentation of extremely layered and complex ideas. I will ask a few questions, and then I will hand over the session to Dr. Sneha Kaur Choudhury. Now, we have been talking about government policies, we were talking about the ethics of cohabitation. But do you think that ethics of care or care ethics, which deals with the relationship of an individual with another individual, could be useful in orienting an individual towards interreligious understanding and for a kind of a conflict free life? This is one question. And the second question is that, since secularism nowadays has become such a fraught word, it has got so many layers of meanings kind of uh, pouring into it. Now, do you really think that being pluralistic is equivalent to being secular? These are the two questions that I had, and I would like to have your feedback, your
Oh,
input.
thank you very much. Yeah, so I would answer the first question first. Now, when we talk about ethics of care, that can actually be a very good entry point to, to imagine alternative relationships between communities, whether religious communities or other kinds of communities. Number one, when we move from, as Carol Gilligan famously
Mm,
says, when we move from this justice oriented ethical notions to the
mm,
care oriented ethical notions,
mm,
we actually come up with more concrete ideas about ethical ways of relating to the others. So when we talk about justice, we often talk about things in abstract terms, but we do talk about concrete human beings and concrete contexts of ethical action when we talk about ethics of care. So that can actually be a very good entry point to the understanding of interreligious relationships and interreligious understanding. Secondly, that is also something which has been witnessed in the subcontinent time and again. And Amitabh Ghosh, for instance, gives a lot of instances of that in his writings whenever he talks about riots. For instance, in an antique land, he talks about the ways in which the common people were actually driven by the ethics of care, and they came up to help each other even in the midst of a conflict. And that's why I was continuously talking about the role of the common people, and the idea that the elites are going to say that it's not like that. Rather, as Ashish Nandi points out, they have their own discourses and praxis of hospitality which we need to learn from. So this is one thing. Then we come to the notion of secularism. Yeah, now see, as I said, and that's why whenever I talked about secularism, actually, unconsciously, I put it within quotes, because secularism has a plethora of meanings which are sometimes a bit contradictory. For instance, the separation of religion from the state. Now,
mm,
whether that kind of secularism is possible in India, whether that's prevalent in India, whether that's desirable in India, and this kind of debate has been done today. Uh, and Sudipta Gobiraj, in one of, not one, in fact, in some of his writings, he has argued that the way religion and state are, coming together in India in various contexts, not just at the macro level, but also at the micro level. So that might actually make us seriously rethink, the efficacy of this kind of secularism. And we might even, wish to go back to the earlier it should be completely separated. That is one thing. Then, on the other hand, you have the critics of secularity, and of course, there are many agonistic thinkers. For instance, William Connolly himself is a critic of the notion of secularism. He says that there is actually intolerance embedded in the secularist position as well, because the secularist position always assumes holier than thou approach, that I know everything
Yeah.
and I am rational or not. So that's why I would say that I would not personally like to define secularism in any way. But I would say that when someone thinks that he or she is secular and hence superior to the religious person, then that approach also needs to be subjected to self-reflexive kind of intervention. That's absolutely required.
No. Why did you say that superior? Because I mean, why? So there is always a hierarchy between being secular and being religious. So one
And
is superior to the other.
that's the problem. That's the problem, that somehow the secular is associated with the rational and the religious is not. So all these ideas are there. And another problem is that when we talk about being secular, now I think that in this context we also need to mention one thing, that is being secular is something which is always context specific. For instance, and of course you also need to think about the specific definition that you might have in mind. For instance, are you saying that you are not discriminating against any particular community in terms of that person's religious orientation or faith orientation? And do you mean to say that you are secular and that's why you are able to be tolerant to the others? But my point is that if that is the definition of secularism, then that is something which a religious actor can also manifest. So it's not the case that a religious person would be necessarily agonistic or prone to the promotion of religious conflict. So that's something which we need to think about. And then, when we talk about pluralism, and this is actually a very interesting question that you have raised, thanks for that. When we talk about pluralism, we need to understand that secularism is not the same as pluralism. It is part of the pluralist fabric of a society. So the
Yes,
secular
actually,
person, yeah,
if you think about the Tagorian model of India, he
yeah.
believed in a pluralistic India. So, I mean, how would you kind of define this? I mean, is it a secular India that he was talking about, or something else? That is something I would like to know.
Yeah, let's see. When we that's why I am talking about multi-faith dialogues, interreligious understanding, and all these ideas, because earlier we used to believe in the binary of the religious and the secular, secularism, communalism, all these things. But now we know that these binaries will not work. For instance, if you look at some of the atheistic or even new atheistic writings of certain Western scholars, you will find terrible comments about certain religious communities, right? Intolerant comments. There are even terrible intolerant comments about women who are sometimes supposed to be, not so rational. And this is really surprising, that
And
some
I
male,
find atheism extremely intolerant.
exactly,
I mean,
especially new
extremely
atheists.
intolerant. If you say that I'm an atheist, you're basically intolerant.
Exactly. And the idea, and then this intolerance is even something that reaches a new height when an atheist person says that I can say anything about what you hold to be sacred, because because I don't consider
I
that to
don't
be
believe
sacred.
in that.
I don't believe in that, so I can just denigrate it, I can profane it, and I can actually engage in a play of profaning what you hold to be sacred. But
Offending,
my
yeah.
point is different. My point is not that you should not question or critique our religion if there is a regressive ideology involved in that religious framework. My point is that when you protest against some kind of regressive framework in a religion or a regressive ideology there, you can do it in two ways. You can either frame your discourse in such a way that it appears that you are intolerant to that community, and you can also do this in an open-ended way so that your message appears to invite conversation. So on the one hand, you try
Yes,
to bracket off all possibilities of conversation. On the other hand, you open it up to conversation. So
yes,
here
yes.
the mode of
Unbracketing. Yes, so it is dialogism that is going to kind of
The
This is
dialogic,
a lot of
yeah, the dialogically sort of framed message. In fact, that might be more effective because in that
more
case
effective.
you are
More
not
effective
even
than policies.
exactly
Than
even
policies which are imposed from above. Yes.
exactly. So I always talk about conversational models, conversational paradigms, rather than confrontational paradigms. That so I am logical and I am going to impose my logic on you, but you need to devise new ways of conversation because conversation, the sort of the frameworks of conversation are also something that you need to reinvent from time to time, and that's
Right.
something which we need to understand. But we think that communication is very simple. So you have a message, you put it out, and the more sensational you can be, the better it is. But the point is that this sort of obsession with sensationalism is something that we need to rectify, because being sensational is not important at all. Rather, it's dangerous sometimes. What is more important is being dialogic. That you are critiquing my religious perception, but you are doing in such a way that you are inviting a conversation with me. So it and you can even maintain respect while critiquing some other ideology. So respect and critique are not really mutually exclusive.
Hmm.
That's what I would say. Because respect
Thank
can
you.
be a mode of communication. Yeah.
Thank you. I hand over the whole session to Sneha. Sneha will conduct if there are
Yeah,
other questions.
there is one question for Annoy. This has been asked by Shudipta Datta, one of our students who topped the MA batch recently. His question is long, and I'm going to read it out. Are the notions of plurality, inclusivity, and tolerance enough in the context of sustaining the peace at the domestic and institutional level in a time when the neoliberals and the capitalists are trying to establish conflict as human nature? If they are so, then why the Quran or other religious texts are not included along with those Chotoder Ramayan or Chotoder Mahabharat or the stories from Bible in the so-called quote-unquote secular educational syllabi? Yes, this is the question. Yes.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I thank you for that. So it's true, as I said, the so-called secular education is actually not just inadequate in terms of fostering multiple dialogues, but it's rather sometimes destructive. It operates in a destructive way because the moment you push religious affairs to the domain of the unspeakable, you are actually inviting, in a way, the return of the repressed. So it's going to
Yes.
sort of backfire in a terrible way.
Mhm.
This is one thing. Then
Mhm.
secondly, it's true, and I personally corroborate this idea that when the
Mhm.
celebration of Agon goes on, we often tend to ignore the capitalist sort of matrix within which this is being celebrated. And this is something which I try to point out time and again. And that's why I actually referred to Claudio Colagori's idea of the agonal rationality. And he actually tries to say that when you are celebrating agonal rationality, you are trying
Mhm.
to define human beings in terms of their destructive
Mhm.
potential. And Professor
Definitely.
Chakraborty was referring to Tagore, and that is very interesting in this context because Tagore himself
Mhm.
said time and again that human
Mhm.
society and human culture don't evolve just through competition. So he was not really going to endorse this idea of the universal presence of competitiveness. He would rather say that there is
Mhm.
collaboration, and collaboration is more important than competition. So I think this idea of collaboration is something which needs to be fostered not within a capitalist framework, but rather within a framework that can question all kinds of sort of agon or agonism, uh, and also the capitalist framework. That's very important because most often we
Mhm.
think that
Mhm.
the liberal thinking should be done within the capitalist framework. We can't
Mhm.
imagine
Mhm.
an other space,
Mhm.
different space. So that different space has to be carved out.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the excellent presentation as well, because it was something that our students must have learned a lot from. And it, as usual, it was very erudite and dense. And thank you again for making this excellent presentation. Now we will move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is our former student, Subroto Bishwas. He is currently assistant professor of English at Mahadevananda College, which is affiliated to West Bengal State University. And he was a former student of our department, and he is currently he has submitted his PhD under the supervision of Professor Shipra Mukherjee, and he is expert. His areas of expertise are post-colonial studies, literary environmental criticism, and cultural studies. Today, his paper is titled Mapping Sustainability: An Eco-Environmental Approach. Now, over to Subroto. I just want to ask him what is the duration of his paper. How long will you speak? Yes, what?
Half an hour or so.
Okay, thank you. We will take the questions after that. Okay, now
Okay.
over to Subroto.
Thank you, ma'am. Good evening, everyone. At the outset, I would like to thank the Center for Studies in Gender, Culture and Media, West Bengal State University, for offering me this platform to share my views on the topic rereading sustainability. This evening, I'll be presenting a paper titled Mapping Sustainability: An Eco-Environmental Approach. Uh, I'll basically be sharing my views and ideas that I have learned and gathered from my critical engagement with eco-environmental studies and sustainability issues. Um, the topic that I have chosen today is so well known that I'm afraid the audience may get bored at times. However, my objective would be to make the audience think, and at the end of my lecture, I would be curious to know what the audience think of the discourse that I am about to put forward to. I have included both fiction and non-fiction in my uh, approach to illustrate the topic that I have chosen today. I have a small presentation to share as well. So now I'm going to directly start my presentation. Is my screen visible?
Not yet. Now it's coming. Let's. No, it's visible now. Yes, it's visible now.
Okay, here we
Yes,
go.
it is visible. Yes.
The very first slide of my presentation displays two different images. The reason I have displayed these two antithetical images is to ask a very fundamental question. And as the title of my slide talks about modernity versus sustainability. So, the fundamental question that I want to ask is, how come the modern and so called civilized nations of the world find it an uphill task to handle what the uncontacted and isolated tribes, like the Amazonian tribes or some of the tribes of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, have been doing so effortlessly for ages? I actually mean the sustainable use of resources that nourish us and the harmonious sharing of the same with the other non human species. The basic difference we can identify is anthropocentrism. Modern civilization, as it starts its journey in the West, has been hardcore anthropocentric as opposed to those non anthropocentric indigenous tribal civilization. Abrahamic religious traditions had injected this sort of toxic anthropocentric worldview to the greater half of humanity. From the West, such human centered values and practices got disseminated to the other parts of the world in the form of a cultural hegemony. Sustainability and well being cannot be achieved unless we are ready to give up this deep rooted hubris in the form of a faith in the supremacy of the humans and a disregard for the non human life forms. And here I have chosen to quote Ramchandra Guha in his book, How Much Should We Consume? Guho points out a basic difference between the indigenous tribal practices and the so called aggression shown by the civilized society. So here I quote: the tribals' battles against nature are conducted with a bow and a snare. Ours, urban omnivores, are waged with chainsaw, oil drills, automobiles, and bombs. It is we, the allegedly civilized, who have decimated forests and the wildlife that previously sustained both tiger and tribal. With our rifles and quest for trophies, we first hunted wild species to extinction. Now we disguise ourselves as conservationists and complain that Adivasis are getting in the way. The irony, in fact, is that we, the humans, are not at all indispensable. The earth would flourish quite well even we, the humans, as a species, cease to exist. But interestingly enough, the ecosystems would collapse if all the insect population die, or even the worms and microbes die. The faith in the absolute supremacy of the human race has made us thus nothing less than a pestilence or parasite to Mother Earth. I may be sounding a little harsh, but that is actually the bitter truth if we look underneath. Thus, here at this point, I want to ask a basic question: shouldn't we be ashamed of our stupidity? This stupidity, again, has become the main driving force of today's models of economic growth. The next aspect with regard to sustainability would be the issue of population. Be more specific, population growth. Here I have quoted Anita Desai's The Village by the Sea. A humble cart driver expresses this particular concern. I quote, "Nothing is enough. We are too many on earth now. Not enough fuel for all, not enough food, not enough jobs. Too many people, not enough to go around." It was not so. The collective ecological footprint of humanity actually has grown so big that there is hardly any room for other life forms to flourish. We are 7.9 billion in number as of today. By 2050, the United Nations predicts a world population of 9.7 billion. Thus, there remain two alternatives as to how to reduce the footprint to a sustainable or bearable state. Number one, to consume less and live like ascetics. Number two, to reduce the population itself. The first option is definitely not going to work. It is impossible to curb human aspiration. When success or affluence becomes synonymous with accumulation and exploitation of resources, no moral or ethical teaching would work. Therefore, it is wise to control population. Since medical science has given us unprecedented control over death, it is time we took control of birth as well. We cannot afford to multiply endlessly. If sustainability if sustainability is to be ensured without compromising or sacrificing aspiration, we need to set goals to control population globally. The excuse of young and productive population cannot be used always to ignore the gravity of the situation. No third option like global sharing of surplus resources on the part of the affluent nations or equal access to global ecological benefits seems practically feasible because we are yet to become selfless enough to create that kind of a utopia. But regarding population growth, we should also keep the other nuances in mind, and that is controlling population alone without regulating consumption is not going to bear the desired result either. In this context, I want to quote Vandana Shiva. Shiva, in his book Earth Democracy, says, and I quote, "Controlling the populations without controlling production and consumption patterns does not address the environmental crisis. The largest pressure on resources does not come from the large numbers of the poor, but from the wasteful production systems, long distance trade, and overconsumption in the first world. Reducing populations of local communities and ignoring the burden of the global market cannot protect the ecosystems of the South." The global capitalist market and the popular cultural hegemony of consumerism throw further challenge to sustainability. And here again, I find Anita Desai's The Village by the Sea equally relevant. Again, that illiterate cart driver says, "Now we want everything to come from the shops, ready made. No more spinning of yarn, no more grinding of wheat at home, and no more making of cow dung cakes or compost. I don't know why. What is this new disease?" And if such trend of economic growth, consumption, and the desire for more continues, then this is going to be the picture of today's reality. So if we blindly follow the lifestyle and pattern of consumption of the first world, then Mother Earth won't be enough for us to sustain the entire population of the world. For example, if we follow the uh, pattern of consumption of the United States, then the entire population of the world would need uh, 5 Earths at the size of the one we are inhabiting now. So here at the bottom of this chart, we have India. Fortunately enough, India, with its current pattern of consumption, is yet to uh, overexploit this resources of Mother Earth, and we have 0.7 times the resources of the Earth that is available. And in this context, we can find Guho's assertion equally relevant, just as it is impossible to create a world, and I quote, peopled entirely by omnivores, like the consumption pattern of the United States. It is equally fallacious to suppose that ecosystem people want to remain as they are, like the Indians consuming 0.7 times of the resources, that they do not want to massively enhance their own resource consumption. So there is no reason of self satisfaction that as Indians we require only uh, 0.7 times of the resources of the earth, but we cannot guarantee that we do not aspire for more. Thus, material development should not be viewed as the be all and end all of our existence, but survival and sustainability should. And in the context of India, I want to illustrate my concern further. This is a study carried out by Greenpeace and quoted by Bahar Dutt in her work Greenverse. And she says a study by Greenpeace shows that a rapidly growing rich consumer class in India produces 4.5 times more carbon emissions than the poorer class and 3 times more than the global average. Thus, a cultural makeover is also what we need to get ourselves sensitized, sensitized towards sustainability. Anything ecologically stressful and wasteful should be censured, and at the same time, ecologically sustainable practices should be encouraged. As Vandana Shiba says, ecological security is our most basic security. Ecological identities are our most fundamental identity. We are the food we eat, the water we drink, the air we breathe. And reclaiming democratic control over our food and water and our ecological survival is the necessary project for our freedom. The urban omnivores have to realize their ecological obligations as well. They cannot expect the poor and the unprivileged ecosystem people to give up their aspiration and work like grassroots ecologists to clean up the mess the city has been making. And I find Guho making a relevant observation here, and I quote, contemporary Gandhian environmentalists such as Medha Patkar and Sundarlal Bahuguna see cities as corrupting and factories as polluting, morally as well as ecologically. The opportunities the city offers and the commodities it produces are regarded as ephemeral, unconnected with the good life. The peasant must remain a peasant, indeed, they would say. He wants to remain a peasant. So, this is, as we can easily understand, a fallacy of the typical romantic environmentalist approach. Now, if we talk about the possible measures in brief, first of all, dialogues and negotiations are going to be very effective. It is true that the more we discuss this issue, the more we can spread the message and persuade others to share our concern. But only talking would make little difference unless we get to see action and implementation. For that, we need to actively involve the democratically elected governments. This has to be done at the local as well as global levels with common goals and cooperation. But to get the governments to action seems to be an uphill task at this moment. How to convince the political leaders and their governments when they see no immediate benefits to harvest with regard to the electoral cycles that they target? If activists, social action groups, and the common mass, who are the electors, can create pressure strong enough to draw the attention of the competent authorities, we may see action and implementation. Small adjustments and individual sacrifice would make little difference. Collective measures, proper planning, legal steps, and local as well as global cooperation can turn the tide. Sociocultural bodies and institutions with religious affiliation can also play a vital role in spreading awareness. The geopolitical factors cannot be forgotten either. The third world or the developing world, with its bitter experience of colonial exploitation and recent imperialist threats, may feel deprived of their access to resources. As Dr. Mahathir bin Mohamad, former Malaysian Prime Minister, in United Nations conference at Rio de Janeiro, claimed that we, the developing world, is yet to fulfill our quota of polluting the environment. We have to catch up with the West that has already fulfilled its quota of pollution. So, if such deadlock of dialogues are the result of the third world's response to environmental issues, then it is going to be very difficult to see collective measures. And should we commit the same crime to Mother Earth? Can we justify one mistake, that is the mistake committed by the West, by citing the example of another? That would only create a deadlock and nothing fruitful would come out of it. Ecology and sustainability cannot be viewed as distant issues, as issues to be deferred for tomorrow. Like economy and development, they are very much today's issue. And we have to stop viewing ecological sustainability as the opposite of economic growth. The two must be reconciled. If we always present the two as binaries, it is going to create further problems. If we divorce economy from ecology, it would be impossible to motivate the poor and the ecosystem people to go for sustainability. Benefits of organic farming must go directly to the farmer. People and tribes who depend on the forest for sustenance must be safeguarded as part of the forest conservation policies. If damming a river, urbanization, and industrialization destroy forest cover and natural habitat, more sanctuaries are to be created to restore balance. Modern science and technology must be complemented with indigenous knowledge and cultural values. We must remember that appreciation and appropriation of indigenous knowledge are what we need badly. Sustainable harvesting of resources and use of soil, water, and air without depleting them are great lessons we must learn from the pre modern indigenous practices of diverse ethnic groups. We have to realize that there is no harm in slowing down or downshifting the gear of development of material growth. If we do not, Mother Nature would surely do it in the cruelest possible manner. The ongoing pandemic is a burning example of the same. We must not wait for more man made disasters to hit. Recovery would be very difficult if we defer today's problem and remain inactive. And the crisis or the problem of climate change, as Amitav Ghosh says in his thought provoking work, The Great Derangement, is wicked in nature. That is, if we defer our action, turning the wheel would be more tedious than ever. And here again, I find Amitav Ghosh's Gun Island uh, aptly capturing the reality of today's world. This is the statement made by Pia, the cytologist. We are in a new world now. No one knows where they belong anymore, neither humans nor animals. So it is like a global tragedy of ecological crisis, and the humans are the tragic heroes. If we don't take measures, then we are going to reach a point of no return. Then only we can lament like Macbeth. Should I wait no more, returning were as tedious as go over. So we don't want to find ourselves in such a position that it would be impossible for us to turn the tide and restore sustainability. So that's all I had planned to share with the audience today. And I would be curious to know what the audience think of, because this is an issue that should be shared and talked about by everyone. Unless we get everyone involved in talking, in discussing, and sharing, it won't be possible for an individual or a small group to achieve the desired result. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Shubhrata বিশ্বাস, for this very thought-provoking presentation. Now, if there are any questions from Professor Mukherjee or Annoy Mukhopadhyay or Professor Chandaba Chakraborty, because from the audience there are no questions as of yet. So we will like, if possible, if you have any questions, or maybe then I will move on to the formal vote of thanks. There are no questions from the audience.
Yeah,
So
I
I
have no.
think, yes.
Yeah,
Or no, if
yeah.
you have a question, please.
It's not a question, it's actually a comment. I'm very happy that Shubhrata took up some of the issues that I was also discussing. We need to question the capitalist ethics of consumption and all these things. So without so, in order to make the discourse of sustainability more meaningful, we need to engage in that, that critical practice as well. So that's why, I would also like to thank you for bringing this issue. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so with this comment from Professor Dr. Mukhopadhyay, we would now come up to the end of this program, and I would give the formal vote of thanks. I would first like to thank our director, Professor Chandrabha Chakraborty, for organizing this lecture series and for giving all her effort to sort of establish the efficacy of the center, which is new and fledging, but it has been quite proactive in during the pandemic as well. Then for today, I would like to thank Dr. Annoy Mukhopadhyay and Shubhrata Bishwas for their excellent presentations on issues of sustainability. We look forward to hosting them again in the future for some other event of the center. Then our thanks to our colleague Professor Shipra Mukherjee, who had come and listened to her fellows presentation. Then I would like to thank our very efficient technical team of our former and current students. They are Aritro Banerjee, Shilajit Bishwas, Diti Chattopadhyay, Adrija Ghosh, and Sudipta Dotto. And finally, I would end by thanking the audience, and we will come back soon with more events. So for today, it is goodbye and thank you for us. Okay. Okay. Is there anything that Professor